They didn't break into homes. In the middle of the night, they were invited in. Smiling, stylish, camera-ready. A husband and wife team who promised to turn ordinary houses into dream homes. They spoke the language of TikTok, of Pinterest boards, and before and after reels. They posed in front of half-finished staircases, glossy countertops, and custom lighting. They said the right words, custom luxury architect designed. And then, for dozens of families across North Texas, the walls started cracking. The floors began to sink. Staircases wobbled. The money disappeared. And the dream homes never came. One homeowner walked through what was supposed to be her newly renovated kitchen and realized the floor was literally sinking beneath her feet. Another family stared at a half-demolished living room, bare studs, loose wires, crooked framing, and realized they had already paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for this. Behind the Instagram posts and TikTok videos, behind the perfectly curated Chip and Joanna aesthetic, was something else. Bank accounts, wire transfers, and a multi-million-dollar fraud that would eventually pull in the FBI, the Secret Service, and federal prosecutors. This isn't the story of a contractor who just did a bad job. It's the story of how a modern social media power couple allegedly turned trust, aspiration, and the American dream of homeownership into a personal ATM, and how, beneath it all, something far more fragile was breaking. Their judgment, their ethics, their grip on reality. Tonight, we're digging into the case of Christopher and Raquel Judge, the TikTok couple at the center of a $5 million dream home scheme that left over 40 victims scattered across North Texas. How does a seemingly loving couple, building a brand and a business together, slide from ambition into deception? At what point does a struggling entrepreneur become a fraudster? And in a world where we increasingly hire people because we like their vibe, online, what happens when that vibe is a mask? This is not a dramatization. All events are based on real reporting, court records, and victim statements. Welcome to Broken Minds, where we explore how ordinary people lose control. Before we go deeper, if you're into long-form, psychological true crime, the why and not just the what, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Broken Minds, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. And as you're listening, I want to know, do you think social media makes fraud like this easier or just more visible? Drop your thoughts in the comments as we go. To understand how this all happened, we need to rewind a few years, back to the early 2020s, right as the world was changing. It's the middle of the pandemic. People are at home more than ever. The housing market is heating up, interest rates are low, and suddenly, everyone is looking around at their walls, their kitchens, their cramped spaces, and thinking, maybe we should finally renovate. Maybe this is a time for our dream home. At the same time, TikTok and Instagram are full of DIY transformations. Flip this house in 60 seconds. From disaster to designer chic. Hundreds of thousands of views for time-lapse videos of tile installations, cabinet makeovers, and new builds. Into this world step Christopher and Raquel Judge, a Fort Worth area couple with a polished online presence and a brand. Judge DFW LLC. They weren't just selling construction. They were selling a story. In their posts, they painted themselves as a one-stop shop. Architecture, custom designs, tailored to your family. Construction, from the foundation to the final paint. Interior design and decor. The finishing touches that make it feel like home. Christopher, in particular, presented himself as the brain behind the builds, the architect, the guy who could walk into a space, see what it could be, and sketch it into reality. Neighbors and potential clients saw a couple who looked like they'd stepped out of an HGTV casting call. One victim would later say they came into her home and pitched themselves as like this Chip and Joanna Gaines type of vibe. And that's important, because before fraud can work on paper, it has to work on people. These weren't anonymous scammers hiding behind burner emails. Christopher and Raquel were present. They met clients in person. They joined local Facebook groups, Alliance Working Moms, Moms of Southlake, places where people instinctively lower their guard because it feels like community. Imagine you're a homeowner in North Texas. Scrolling through your feed, you see photos of gorgeous exteriors, clips of remodeled kitchens, Raquel smiling in progress videos, captions about another dream home in the making, The comments say things like, "Love your work. Can't wait to have you guys come to our place." You're transforming the DFW area one home at a time. You see other moms tagging friends. At Jessica, you should reach out to them for your kitchen. It's not just marketing, it's social proof. And social proof, combined with a likable couple, is powerful. If you're watching this and you've ever hired someone based on Instagram or TikTok, let me know in the comments. Did you check licenses and records, or did you just trust the content? Be honest. So how did the judges win people over once they were in the door? According to court filings and victim accounts, the pitch was remarkably consistent. They'd come to your home or meet remotely and listen to your vision. Christopher would talk through architectural possibilities, removing walls, expanding rooms, completely new builds. They'd offer you a below-market bid, something that made you feel like you were getting a deal without it sounding suspiciously low. They'd promise a timeline, 4 to 6 months for completion. For many homeowners, that was irresistible. In a market where other contractors were overloaded, slow to respond, or quoting eye-watering numbers, Christopher and Raquel presented themselves as a solution. Responsive, talented, affordable, and best of all, a couple you could relate to. One victim, Kristen Newman, later told a local Texas outlet that at first, everything seemed fine. Christopher carried himself like a seasoned professional, the kind of person who could say things like structural load, design footprint, and permit process in a way that sounded authoritative, not rehearsed. They signed a contract. They scheduled payments, installments, usually by wire transfer or check. Construction began. At least in the beginning. Here's where psychology starts to twist. Because on the surface, this looked like a growing business. New clients coming in, projects starting all over the Fort Worth area. But behind the scenes, according to the FBI and federal prosecutors, something very different was happening. The judges weren't just juggling projects. They were juggling reality itself, between what they told clients, what they could actually deliver, and what they were doing with the money. Before we unravel that, if you're still with me, take a second to like this video. It really helps more people discover these deep dive cases. And if you want more stories where we go beyond the headlines into the minds and motives behind crimes, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Comment subscribed, so I know you're part of the Broken Minds community. Behind the brand, who were Christopher and Raquel Judge? Public records and reporting don't paint Christopher and Raquel as monsters from day one. That's part of what makes this case unnerving. They were a married couple, running a small business, operating in a booming, high-pressure market. It's entirely possible, and this is a pattern seen in many fraud cases, that they did have legitimate ambitions at first, to build beautiful homes, to be known in their community, to grow something real. But somewhere between aspiration and execution, a series of choices pushed them over a line they could no longer step back from. Christopher, according to the Texas Board of Architecture, repeatedly described himself in the business in ways that suggested licensure and professional status he simply did not have. In May 2022, the board issued a formal warning to him and Judge DFW, telling them they were violating state rules by using the word architect and architecture when neither he nor the company was properly registered. Think about that. By 2022, a state regulatory body had already told them, "You're misrepresenting who you are." That was a fork in the road. They could have corrected the branding, changed how they pitched themselves, gotten honest. They didn't. Instead, the social posts kept coming. The projects kept being sold. And the money, according to federal investigators, kept flowing into accounts that didn't just fund lumber and labor. They funded a lifestyle, personal mortgage payments, Amazon purchases, plastic surgery, cash withdrawals. But to understand how this didn't fall apart immediately, we have to look at what was happening at the job sites and how, for months and sometimes years, clients convinced themselves everything was still okay. Because the first cracks, literal and metaphorical, didn't always look like fraud. At least, not at first. In part 2, we'll step inside those homes, hear from the victims, and traced the subtle shift from normal construction delays to the sinking realization that their so-called dream home builders might not just be incompetent, they might be lying. And once you start suspecting your contractor is lying about timelines, about money, about who they even are, what do you do? Do you confront them? Do you cut your losses? Or do you keep hoping that if you just give them one more payment, it'll finally all work out? Stay tuned for the rest of this conversation. Tell me in the comments, what's the first red flag that would make you pull the plug on a contractor? I'll be reading your answers as we continue this story. If you've ever lived through a renovation, you know this. There's almost always a point where things look worse before they look better. Walls get torn down. Floors are ripped up. Exposed wiring, piles of debris, tools everywhere. It's chaotic, unsettling, but you tell yourself, this is normal. This is progress. For many of Christopher and Raquel Judge's clients, that's exactly how it started. At first, the dust and noise were just signs that the dream was underway, until, slowly, the dust stopped moving and nothing else did. Let's go back to one of the victims we heard about earlier, Kristen Newman. Kristen hired the Judges to transform her home. Christopher pitched himself as an architect and builder. He talked confidently about structural changes, design flow, and how quickly they could complete the project. In the beginning, she said, things seemed fine. Demolition started. Materials appeared. Subcontractors showed up. There was movement. And then the pace dropped. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Pieces of the project sat half-finished. Some things that should have been quick, like completing a room or addressing a simple fix, kept getting pushed back. Kristen recalled a shift in her own mindset. At first, she asked casual questions. Hey, how's the schedule looking? When will the tile be done? Then, when excuses stacked up and timelines kept slipping, her questions sharpened. Why isn't this done? Why are we behind? Where exactly is the money going? According to her account, there came a moment when she'd overpaid for something that hadn't been done. She asked for the extra money back, pointing out that the incomplete work was supposed to be covered by a different payment draw. Christopher's response was chilling in its simplicity. I don't have it anymore. That sentence, I don't have it anymore, is one of those moments where the veil slips. You're not talking about a delay. You're talking about the disappearance of funds that were never supposed to disappear. If you're watching this and you've ever gotten that sinking feeling with a contractor, let me know in the comments. At what point would those words make you stop everything? And while you're here, if this deep dive format is your kind of true crime, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Broken Minds. It helps us keep making long-form, psychology-focused content like this. Another victim, Lane Simmons, hired the Judges for what was supposed to be a home transformation. Lane said they came to her house and pitched themselves as that same Chip and Joanna Gaines type couple, fun, friendly, visionary. The kind of people you'd not only trust with your house, but invite to a barbecue afterward. They got the job. But once the work was done, the problems revealed themselves fast. Lane later described walking through her home and seeing cracking tile only weeks after installation, floors cracking and shifting, a kitchen floor sinking, as if the ground itself couldn't support what had been done, exterior trim that looked like it had been slapped on by a child, framing so poor that entire sections had to be torn out and rebuilt, a staircase that was so dangerously constructed it had to be completely redone. It had apparently been held up by a single internal board. A family friend who was also a contractor came over, looked at the work, and told him something that went beyond disappointment. He said much of it was unsafe, and that it was among the worst jobs he'd ever seen. These weren't just cosmetic issues. This was structural incompetence, or worse, indifference. For a moment, let's pause and think about the psychology here, not from the victim's side, but from the Judge's perspective. To live like this, to show up in front of someone's family, agree to rip apart their home, take hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then leave shoddy, dangerous work behind, you have to do something inside your own mind. You either minimize the damage, you'll fix it later, it's not that bad, everyone in construction does this. Or you disconnect. It's just business. They'll sue if they really care. It's not my problem. Somewhere in the judge's thought process, the humanity of what a home really is, safety, stability, identity, had to be overridden by something else. Cash flow, image, momentum. And as more victims came forward, a pattern emerged. The federal complaint and victim testimony paint a consistent picture of how projects unfolded. The start, initial demolition, or groundwork would begin. Just enough visible activity to reassure the client that things were underway. The stall, after the early visible work, progress would slow or stop. Subcontractors might not return. Materials might not arrive. Clients would start asking questions. The excuses, supply chain delays, labor shortages, permit issues, personal problems, illnesses, emergencies. Christopher reportedly always had a reason, always something just around the corner that would set everything right if the client would just be patient. The pressure for more money. Despite the lack of visible progress, clients were often told that the next stage required another payment. We just need this draw to order X. We're about to bring in the crew, but we need funds released first. The emotional manipulation. Phrases like, "we're almost there," or "we don't want to let you down," reinforce the idea that everyone was on the same team. Some victims likely felt guilty, as if pushing back too hard would make things worse or ruin the relationship. If you've ever been in that situation, where you feel uneasy, but you're already financially and emotionally invested, you know how hard it is to pull the plug. You tell yourself, "we've come this far. It would be worse to start over. I don't want to be the difficult client." That hope, that constant, fragile hope that it will still work out, is something fraudsters frequently rely on. It buys them time, and time lets them repeat the same pattern with new victims. Drop a comment if you've ever second-guessed your instincts because you didn't want to be that client. Did you regret not listening to your gut sooner? At this point, you might be thinking, okay, this all sounds awful, but where's the line between a terrible contractor and a criminal fraudster? That's where the timing and truthfulness of their representations come in. It's one thing for a builder to overpromise, underestimate a timeline, run into unexpected problems. It's another thing entirely to lie about professional credentials, like being an architect, take money under the pretense it'll be used for your project, while using it to fund someone else's or their own lifestyle. Continue to sign contracts and solicit more victims, even after regulatory warnings and mounting complaints. By May 2022, as we mentioned in Part 1, the Texas Board of Architecture had already issued a formal warning to Christopher and Judge DFW, telling them to stop calling him an architect or using architecture in their branding. But according to the federal indictment, the scheme didn't stop there. Instead, the couple allegedly continued to represent Christopher as an architect to new customers, continued to market themselves as a one-stop architectural and construction firm, and continued to take large wire transfers and checks into their business account. Once that money hit the account, investigators say a significant portion didn't go to structural engineers, quality subcontractors, or even legitimate building materials. Instead, it was often transferred into jointly held accounts and used to pay personal mortgage payments, cash withdrawals, Amazon purchases, plastic surgery, and more. From October 2020 to January 2023, FBI analysis suggests that roughly $865,000 in client installment payments were spent on purely personal expenses. By this point, we are no longer in the gray area of bad business. We're in the territory of wire fraud, using interstate wires and banking systems to obtain money under false pretenses. But even with warning signs, even with cracked tiles and half-demolished homes, many homeowners still struggle to get law enforcement to take their cases seriously. Why? Because to a lot of local agencies, this still looked like a contractor dispute, the kind that usually ends up in civil court, not a criminal indictment. It would take persistence, a determined local police department, and the attention of federal investigators to reframe this story from botched jobs to an alleged multi-million-dollar fraud conspiracy. In Part 3, we'll follow that shift. We'll look at how victims tried and often failed to get help, how one Texas police department finally took on the case, and how the FBI and Secret Service began piecing together a pattern that stretched across 6 counties and at least 24 construction projects. And once investigators started tracing the money, what they found in those bank records would turn a messy business story into a federal crime. Before you move on, let me know in the comments, at what point do you think local law enforcement should step in on contractor cases like this? And don't forget to like this video and subscribe if you want the rest of this series delivered straight to your feed. By now, the pattern around Christopher and Raquel Judge was becoming undeniable. At least the people living inside half-destroyed homes. Cracked tile, sinking floors, crooked framing, thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of dollars gone. But to the outside world, for a long time, it still looked like what lawyers politely call a business dispute. Homeowners were angry. The judges had excuses. And courts, in most places, are full of those. The real story, the one that turned this into a federal wire fraud conspiracy, was hidden somewhere else. Inside email threads, inside text messages, and most of all, inside bank accounts. For many victims, the first instinct wasn't to call the FBI. It was to call whoever would listen. Some tried. Local police departments, city building inspectors, small claims courts, civil lawyers. They were told to file complaints with the Better Business Bureau, sue in civil court, work it out with the company. Each of those suggestions might make sense individually, but if you've lost $100,000 or more, your home is unlivable, and the people responsible are still out there signing new contracts. File with the BBB starts to sound less like help and more like a shrug. Some departments simply didn't have the resources or expertise to investigate complex white-collar fraud. Others saw it as a private contract issue, not a crime. But one agency did listen, the Euless, Texas Police Department. Euless is a city in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. It's not the FBI. It's not a big city major crimes unit. But they took victims' complaints seriously enough to start digging. And as they dug, they realized something important. This wasn't just one bad project, or one unlucky homeowner, or one contractor walking away early. It was a repeatable pattern. Dozens of families, similar stories, similar financial losses. Euless PD reached out to federal partners, including the FBI and U.S. Secret Service, agencies with the tools and jurisdiction to trace money, analyze digital patterns, and pursue interstate wire fraud charges. If you're watching and you've ever wondered how a local complaint turns into a federal case, let me know in the comments. Did you expect a police department like Euless to be the one who helps crack it? And while you're here, take a second to like this episode and subscribe to Broken Minds. These long-form investigations take time, and your support helps keep them coming. Once the FBI and Secret Service joined the case, things changed. They began by looking where white-collar investigations so often start, the bank records. According to the federal complaint and indictment, many victims were instructed to wire installment payments to the Judge's Chase business account associated with Judge DFW LLC. Others wrote checks payable to the business, which were then deposited into that same account. On paper, that's standard. Customers pay a business. The business pays expenses. But when agents followed the trail further, they found something else. Shortly after deposits from victims landed in the Judge DFW account, significant amounts of money were often transferred out, not to subcontractors or material suppliers, but to other Chase accounts jointly held by Christopher and Raquel. Personal spending categories that had nothing to do with construction. From October 2020 to January 2023, investigators say the couple spent approximately $865,000 of client installment payments on what were clearly personal living expenses, including about $285,000 on payroll payments to themselves, $133,000 in cash withdrawals, $82,000 in purchases through Amazon.com, $70,000 on civil legal fees and lawsuits, $27,000 on personal mortgage payments, $10,000 on plastic surgery, $10,000 at Walmart. Imagine that number for a second, $865,000. That's not a one-time lapse in judgment. That's a pattern of behavior. to the homeowners authorizing those payments. The money was supposed to be funding structural work, licensed professionals, code-compliant construction, safe, livable homes. Instead, a meaningful slice of it was propping up the judge's lifestyle, from surgery to shopping and paying old legal battles, even as new clients walked into the same trap. If you've ever read about major frauds, from Bernie Madoff to smaller investment clubs gone wrong, you'll recognize a familiar shape here. Investigators allege that Christopher and Raquel were effectively intermingling funds from different projects. Money from new clients was sometimes used to patch up older projects just enough to quiet complaints, or keep previous victims at bay, or pay personal expenses. Meanwhile, most projects remained unfinished, riddled with code violations, or so poorly executed they had to be redone by someone else. This is structurally similar to a Ponzi scheme. You promise X. You spend the money on Y. When X doesn't materialize, you use money from a new person to temporarily satisfy the old one and repeat. The difference here is that instead of monthly returns on investments, the currency was partial progress, a few new boards nailed in, a cheap subcontractor showing up for a day, just enough visual work to reassure a homeowner that things were still happening. You could call it construction Ponzi, funded not by Wall Street greed but by middle-class hope. If you're following this and realizing how easily something like this could happen in your own neighborhood, let me know in the comments. Does this change how you'd hire a contractor or builder? Eventually, all of this ended up in writing. A federal indictment filed in the Northern District of Texas. The indictment lays out the prosecution's view of the conspiracy in stark legal language. In essence, it says, the judges advertised Judge DFW through Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, presented themselves as custom home builders offering architecture, construction, and interior design. They falsely represented that Christopher was an architect. Christopher would often provide below-market bids, promising to finish in 4 to 6 months, making their offer especially attractive. Once clients signed contracts and began sending money via wire transfers or checks, the couple did some work, enough to appear legitimate, then frequently stalled. Pressured clients for more payments despite little progress. Moved money out of the business account for personal use. Most damning, the indictment claims that between August 2020 and January 2023, the judges defrauded more than 40 victims across 6 counties in North Texas, connected to at least 24 construction projects, causing total losses of roughly $4.8 million. If you're thinking, how did they get away with this for that long? Part of the answer is timing, and part of it is psychology. Victims weren't just dealing with a faceless company. They were dealing with a couple, a wife sending friendly texts and emails, arranging meetings, posting cheerful project updates in Facebook groups, a husband who presented himself as the expert, the visionary. Confronting them meant confronting not just a contract, but a relationship. And by the time many victims realized the truth, they were already financially overextended, emotionally exhausted, living in construction zones that felt more like ruins. Remember that Texas Board of Architecture warning from May 2022? The board formally notified Christopher and Judge DFW that he was not a licensed architect. The business was not registered as an architectural firm. Calling him an architect and using architecture in the business name violated state regulations. This was the moment the couple was told, clearly and officially, that their marketing crossed a legal line, a turning point. They could have stepped back, changed their branding, corrected how they described themselves, and perhaps tried to rebuild trust in a legitimate way. But according to federal prosecutors, the scheme continued well after that warning. They allegedly kept representing Christopher as an architect. They kept signing new clients. They kept routing large payments into accounts that funded personal expenses. That choice, to keep going after a direct warning, is a key reason why this case looks less like desperation and more like deliberate fraud in the eyes of the law. And yet, even then, not every authority was eager to label a crime. Some homeowners still struggled to get traction. Some were told, that's a civil matter. It would take the accumulated weight of all these stories, all these half-built homes, All these drained bank accounts for the federal government to step in fully. In Part 4, we'll step into the aftermath of the scheme's collapse, how the investigation unfolded step by step, how law enforcement used digital trails and financial records to reconstruct the truth, and what the judges did as the walls began to close in, including their decisions to plead guilty. We'll also explore how federal sentencing actually works and why, even with millions in losses, Christopher's plea deal may cap his prison time far below the 20-year maximum. Before you jump to the rest of the story, tell me in the comments, do you think continuing the scheme after the Architecture Board warning should increase their punishment? And if this breakdown has been eye-opening, please like this video and subscribe to Broken Minds so you don't miss what comes next. When you look at the photos of some of these homes, the crooked trim, the split tile, the half-demolished living rooms, it seems obvious that something was wrong. But in the world of criminal law, obvious is enough. Prosecutors don't just need bad outcomes. They need intent. They need to show that at the time money changed hands, there was a scheme, not just incompetence. That's where the investigation into Christopher and Raquel Judge became crucial. And it's where this story turned from scattered complaints into a federal case. Once the Euless Police Department began taking victim stories seriously, they started to notice something important. The names were the same, Christopher and Raquel Judge. The company was the same, Judge DFW LLC. The stories were eerily similar, large upfront or stage payments. Initial activity, then unexplained delays, poor workmanship or unsafe structures, excuses when questioned, pressure for additional payments. What might look like a one-off nightmare in one suburb of Dallas, Fort Worth area was quietly echoing in 5 others. Euless PD pulled records, contracts, emails, text messages, bank records they could access locally. But they quickly hit a familiar problem for small departments. Scope. This wasn't one house, one neighborhood, or one unlucky homeowner. This was dozens of families across 6 counties, millions of dollars in alleged losses, and financial movement that crossed into federal jurisdiction. So Euless reached up the ladder to the FBI and U.S. Secret Service, both of which handle complex financial crimes and wire fraud. If you're watching this and you've ever wondered how a local contractor horror story becomes a case for federal agents, let me know in the comments. Did you expect agencies like the Secret Service to be involved in something like this? And again, if these deep dives are your kind of true crime, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Broken Minds. It tells the algorithm this is worth showing to more people. Investigators didn't just look at money, they looked at words. Because in fraud cases, what you say to people and when you say it can be just as important as where their money ends up. From what's described in the complaint and summaries from outlets like Law and Crime, Raquel allegedly handled much of the front-end communication, setting up in-person or remote meetings, explaining the construction and design contracts, emailing signed agreements, posting in neighborhood Facebook groups, Alliance Working Moms, Moms of Southlake, touting their services and recent successes. Christopher presented himself as a technical expert, the supposed architect and builder, the person who walked clients through the design, structural changes, and vision, the voice of authority in on-site discussions. The indictment quotes or summarizes marketing language where the judge is, describe themselves as a one-stop shop for architecture, construction, and interior design, refer to Christopher as an architect, use the company branding Judge DFW Architecture, and similar variations. Investigators cross-checked that with records from the Texas Board of Architecture, which had already warned them in May 2022 that they were violating state rules by claiming architectural status without proper licensing and registration databases showing that Christopher was not a licensed architect. Judge DFW was not registered as an architectural firm. That mismatch between how they marketed themselves and what was true became one of the clearest pillars of the fraud case. It showed not just chaos or disorganization, but misrepresentation. Meanwhile, federal agents were doing what they do best, following the money. Subpoenas to banks provided, detailed transaction histories for the Judge DFW LLC account, records of wire transfers from victims, copies of checks deposited into the business account, downstream transfers to other accounts controlled by Christopher and Raquel by overlaying incoming payments from specific clients, contract dates and project timelines, and outgoing transfers and purchases. They began to construct a map. Client A wires $80,000 for phase 1 of their remodel. Shortly afterward, a large portion is moved to a jointly held personal account. From there, money is used on cash withdrawals, mortgage payments, Amazon purchases, lawsuit costs, cosmetic procedures. At the same time, the work at Client A's property either stalls or is done so poorly it has to be redone. There is no evidence that the funds allocated for certain stages were ever fully spent on that project. Repeat that across dozens of victims. Repeat it over years. At some point, it stops looking like poor bookkeeping and starts looking like a scheme. If you're wondering why using the banking system matters so much, here's the key. Every time money crosses state lines or uses certain forms of electronic communication, wires, ACH transfers, even emails in some contexts, it touches interstate commerce. And once you're in interstate commerce, you're in federal territory. That's how a home renovation nightmare in Fort Worth becomes a case in federal court. Just another lie. The psychology of keeping it going. From a psychological standpoint, what's described here fits a pattern many white-collar defense attorneys recognize. It often starts with a legitimate business idea, genuine plans to do things right, maybe even a few early projects that do go relatively well. Then something goes wrong. Costs exceed estimates. Timelines blow up. A key subcontractor falls through. Cash flow dries up. This is the moment where an ethical business owner can come clean, tell clients the truth, eat the loss, or even declare bankruptcy. But for some people, that option feels like self-destruction. They're ashamed, they're afraid, they're greedy, or some mix of all three. So they do something else. They tell one lie. We're just waiting on the city. Supplies are delayed, but we're on it. We just need one more payment to get to the next phase. That one lie buys them time. And with that time, they hope something good will happen. A new contract, a lucky break, a surge of cash that will let them fix everything. When that doesn't happen, they tell another lie and another and another. Over months and years, the lies multiply. To keep them going, you need new money. To get new money, you need new victims. By the time investigators step in, you're no longer just bad at business. You're someone who, over and over, has chosen self-preservation and lifestyle over truth, even as other people's lives crumble. If this idea of fraud as a snowball of lies resonates with you, tell me in the comments. Do you think most fraudsters plan to be criminals from the start, or do they slide into it one decision at a time? Ultimately, the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Texas brought criminal charges. Christopher and Raquel were each indicted on 7-count conspiracy to commit wire fraud, with each count tied to specific sets of victims and transactions. The indictment detailed the marketing misrepresentations, claiming architectural credentials they didn't have, the below-market bids and promised 4 to 6 month timelines, the structure of installment payments, frequently sent by wire or check, the transfer of funds from business accounts to personal accounts, the ultimate losses, totaling roughly $4.8 million across more than 40 victims tied to at least 24 projects. The story that had lived in victims' group chats, emails, and private Facebook messages was now spelled out in black and white, under the seal of federal court. At that point, the legal clock was ticking. Christopher and Raquel had a choice: fight the charges at trial, risking higher sentences if convicted, or plead guilty and hope cooperation and acceptance of responsibility would soften the blow. They chose to plead. But pleading guilty is only the beginning of the end. In federal court, the real question for defendants is rarely just guilty or not. It's, how much time am I going to serve? Next, we'll walk through trial phase decisions, plea deals, and federal sentencing guidelines that determine Christopher and Raquel's futures, including why, despite facing up to 20 years, Christopher's agreement appears to cap his sentence at 78 months. We'll also look at what this all meant for the victims, restitution orders that may never be fully paid, and emotional damage that a courtroom can never completely fix. Before we move on, drop a comment. What do you think is a fair sentence for a fraud that destroys dozens of families' homes and savings? And if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe to Broken Minds so you don't miss the rest of the conversation. By the time the federal indictment was unsealed, the public story had finally caught up to the private reality. Headlines framed it simply: Fort Worth couple pleads guilty in $5 million home building scam. North Texas TikTok dream home duo facing federal prison. But what those headlines can't show is the unseen architecture of federal justice. The careful, almost mathematical way the system decides how much a person will pay for what they've done. In Christopher and Raquel Judge's case, those calculations would mean the difference between a few years behind bars and the better part of a decade. Both Christopher and Raquel ultimately chose to plead guilty, not to every count in the indictment, but to one count each of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. That's a crucial point. In federal prosecutions, it's common for the government to charge multiple counts to reflect the full scope of the alleged conduct, then allow defendants to plead to fewer counts in exchange for avoiding trial, saving government resources, accepting responsibility, and sometimes cooperating. Here, that meant Christopher and Raquel admitted involvement in a wire fraud conspiracy, while the remaining counts were effectively resolved through the plea. For the victims, hearing guilty can be both validating and frustrating. Validating because it acknowledges something criminal happened. It confirms they weren't just difficult clients or unlucky customers. Frustrating because a plea to one count may feel like it doesn't fully capture the emotional and financial devastation across 40-plus families. If you've ever been close to a case where a plea deal was made, tell me in the comments. Did it feel like justice or like a compromise? And if this level of detail around the justice system interests you, like this video and subscribe to Broken Minds. We always go beyond the headline. On paper, the stakes look like this: Christopher Judge, guilty of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Statutory maximum, up to 20 years in federal prison. Raquel Judge, guilty of the same conspiracy count, facing up to 5 years in federal prison. If you stop there, it's easy to think, okay, Christopher might do 20 years. Raquel might do 5. End of story. But that's not how federal sentencing actually works. Enter the United States Sentencing Guidelines, a system designed to bring consistency to sentencing nationwide. In the Law and Crime segment we've been referencing throughout this episode, a federal criminal defense attorney breaks down the guidelines with a simple metaphor. Think of it like Scrabble. Every crime has a base offense level, essentially a starting number of points. Certain factors about how the crime was committed add enhancement points. The amount of money involved, the number of victims, whether the scheme was sophisticated, whether the defendant was a leader or organizer. If a defendant accepts responsibility and pleads guilty, some points are subtracted. Once you have a final offense level, you look at the defendant's criminal history category from I to 6. A sentencing table tells you the recommended range in months. Let's walk through a simplified version of how that likely played out for Christopher. Base offense level for wire fraud, typically around 7 points. Loss amount enhancement, roughly $4.8 to $5 million in losses to victims. Under the guidelines, that kind of loss adds about 18 points. Now we're at 7 base plus 18 loss equals 25 points. Other possible enhancements, depending on how the plea was negotiated. The government might argue for additional points for number of victims, 40 plus. Sophisticated means using multiple accounts, social media, intermingling funds. Role in the offense, if Christopher was treated as a leader/organizer. Let's say, hypothetically, that added several more points, pushing his level into the high 20s. Acceptance of responsibility. By pleading guilty, Christopher likely received a 3-point reduction. So if he were at, for example, 28, he'd drop to 25. If he were at 27, he'd drop to 24. The exact number depends on specific enhancements. Once that final level is set, the sentencing table provides a range, such as 63 to 78 months. or a similar band, depending on the final offense level and criminal history. That's where the key detail mentioned by the defense attorney comes in. Christopher's plea agreement appears to cap his sentence at 78 months, about 6.5 years, even though the statute says up to 20 years. In practical terms, that suggests his guideline range is probably something like 63 to 78 months. The agreement states the judge will not go above 78 if they accept the deal. The judge can still go below that range if they find mitigating reasons. So when people hear 20 years and then see a sentence closer to 5 to 7 years, that's the disconnect. The maximum is a ceiling almost no one hits. The guidelines and the plea deal do most of the real work. For Raquel, the situation is somewhat different. The statutory maximum discussed in media coverage is 5 years. Her role in the offense appears to be framed as handling communications, meetings, contracts, promoting the business on social media, participating in the conspiracy, but perhaps not as the primary architect, no pun intended, of the scheme. Her guidelines would consider the same loss amount, the number of victims, her role, possibly less severe than Christopher's, and her criminal history. While exact numbers aren't publicly spelled out in the coverage we've seen, her potential sentence is likely lower than Christopher's overall, which aligns with her statutory cap of 5 years. Viewers often ask, why does she get less time if she was intimately involved? The answer, in guideline terms, usually boils down to role adjustments, if she's seen as following or facilitating rather than leading. Criminal history, if both were first-time offenders, that helps both. Negotiation, a defendant who cooperates more or poses less perceived ongoing risk, may secure a better deal. If you think co-conspirators should always get the same sentence, say so in the comments. Or, if you believe leaders should shoulder more of the time, I want to hear that too. Regardless of how many months they serve, one part of the sentence is almost guaranteed: restitution. The court can and usually does, or defendants in fraud cases too, repay the millions they stole in the form of a restitution judgment. On paper, that looks like justice. In practice, it often looks like this. The defendant goes to prison. They earn small amounts of money through prison work. A portion, sometimes $25 a month or similarly small sums, is taken to pay restitution. After release, a portion of any wages can be garnished. If they ever receive a windfall, an inheritance, lottery winnings, etc., it can be seized to pay victims. But here's the hard reality. Christopher is being represented by a court-appointed attorney, usually a sign he has very limited assets. For victims who lost $200,000, $300,000, $360,000, the chance of being made whole is slim. As one defense attorney put it, your odds are between slim and none, and slim's out of town. Emotionally, that can be one of the most brutal parts of these cases. You see your perpetrator punished, but not in a way that restores your home. You still have to pay new contractors to fix the damage. You may still be carrying debt from the failed project. The judgment is there in writing, but the money isn't. If you were one of these victims, what would matter more to you? A long prison sentence or a real chance at financial recovery? Let me know in the comments. There's no right answer, just hard trade-offs. In bringing this discussion to a close, we'll step back from the legal numbers and look at what this case really means. The psychological patterns behind fraud like this, the missed warning signs friends, regulators, and even victims might have seen, and what we can learn as consumers and as a society from a couple who turned dream homes into some of the most expensive nightmares of their victims' lives. We'll also end with a core question at the heart of broken minds. Did Christopher and Raquel start out intending to be criminals, or did they become them, one rationalization at a time? Before you continue, please like this video and subscribe if you haven't yet, and share this story with someone you know who's planning a renovation. Not to scare them, but to remind them that trust, when it comes to your home, should always be earned. By now, we've walked through the arc of this case. A seemingly charming couple, a glossy social media brand, dozens of families, half-destroyed homes, and millions of dollars gone. A federal investigation, guilty pleas, the cold math of sentencing. But Broken Minds isn't just about what happened. It's about how it happens inside people and what that says about the rest of us. In this final part, we'll look at the psychology behind schemes like this, the warning signs that slip past regulators, neighbors, and victims, and whether Christopher and Raquel Judge are better understood as calculated predators or as people who cross one line, then another until they couldn't recognize themselves. As always, I want to hear your take. 2. As you listen, drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think they were evil from the start or broken by greed and desperation? And if this series has pulled you in, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Broken Minds. This is where we ask the hard questions about what makes people snap or slowly slide into darkness. Psychologists note when ambition becomes fraud. Disclaimer: I'm not giving a clinical diagnosis of anyone in this story. Instead, this is a psychological lens on patterns we see in similar real-world fraud cases. On the surface, white-collar cases like this can seem less emotional than violent crimes. No gun, no physical assault, no body in a crime scene photo. But that doesn't mean there isn't deep psychology at work. In fact, fraud cases often reveal some of the most complex cognitive distortions. Self-justification and moral neutralization. People who commit fraud often don't think of themselves as criminals, at least not at first. They tell themselves, I'll pay it back. Everyone does this in my industry. They can afford it more than I can. If they really cared, they'd sue me and then I'd deal with it. This neutralizes guilt. They don't have to see themselves as thieves if they can cast a fraud as a temporary shortcut, a business tactic, or even a kind of victimless harm. Entitlement and grandiosity, particularly for people building a public brand. Like a TikTok dream home couple, there can be a growing sense of, we deserve this lifestyle. We work hard, we're talented. The money will catch up. We're special. The rules are for lesser people. When entitlement meets financial pressure, the mind can reframe fraud as just getting what we were already owed. Cognitive dissonance and fragmentation. Imagine being Christopher or Raquel, sitting across from family at their kitchen table, selling them a dream while knowing that previous clients are furious. The state architecture board has already warned you. Your business accounts are a mess. To function day-to-day in that reality, many people split their thinking. One part of the mind lives in performance, confident, visionary, reassuring. Another part pushes away the consequences, the complaints, the damaged lives. That compartmentalization can be a survival strategy until the compartments collapse. The snowball of lies effect, as the defense attorney in the Law and Crime segment described, many fraudsters start with one bad choice, one false promise, one stolen payment they intend to replace. When that doesn't solve the problem, they add another lie and another until they're trapped inside a story they can't maintain without destroying more lives. It's not that empathy disappears overnight. It's that self-preservation slowly chokes it out. If you think about Christopher and Raquel through this lens, you can imagine progression. Ambitious small business owners in a hot market, overpromising in their branding, architect, one-stop shop, running into financial and skill limitations, choosing to lie rather than back down, using new clients to plug old holes, spending client money on lifestyle, perhaps telling themselves they rebuild, rebrand, or make it right later. By the time federal agents showed up, that later had never come. Missed signs, what everyone overlooked. It's too easy, to look back at this case and say, how could anyone fall for that? I'd never trust an unlicensed architect. But hindsight is cruel. In real time, red flags don't come with labels. Let's walk briefly through some warning signs in this case. Not to blame victims, but to help others spot similar patterns in the future. Credential claims that didn't match records. Christopher repeatedly called himself an architect. Judge DFW was pitched as an architecture firm. In a perfect world, everyone would verify licenses before signing anything. Check state licensing boards. Verify company registrations. Ask for proof of insurance and bonding. In reality, people saw a charismatic couple, social proof on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook, friendly interactions in local mom groups. That emotional trust often overshadowed the cold step of verification. Too much focus on image, not enough on process their online presence emphasized. Vibes and aesthetics, before and after style posts, personality. But many victims later discovered a lack of detailed project plans, transparent cost breakdowns, clear permitting and inspection documentation. Below market bids with fast timelines they attracted business by offering lower prices than competitors, promising completion in 4 to 6 months. In a tight construction market, that sounds like a dream. It can also be a classic lure. Payment demands outpacing progress, victims reported, being asked for additional draws before previous stages were complete, owed refunds that weren't available anymore, a widening gap between money paid and work visible. Regulatory warning ignored when the Texas Board of Architecture issued its warning in May 2022. That was a clear sign, at least on paper, that something was off. But most homeowners never see those regulatory actions unless they go looking for them. If you've ever ignored a small red flag because you felt emotionally connected to a contractor, coach, or expert, you're not alone. We all want to believe the story we've already invested in. Tell me in the comments, which of these signs do you think people are most likely to overlook? And which one would make you walk away immediately? So what broke here? On one level, the answer is literal. Floors, staircases, roof lines, bank accounts. Trust. On a deeper level, something broke inside two people. Their ability to tell themselves, this has gone too far. Their willingness to say, we failed, we need to stop. Their connection to the idea that these are real people's homes, lives, and savings. Did Christopher and Raquel start out with criminal intent? We may never know for sure. But based on patterns in similar cases, a plausible narrative is this. They started as overconfident dreamers, building a brand faster than they built real capacity. They were rewarded with likes, comments, contracts for image over substance. When reality failed to keep up, they chose to bend the truth instead of scaling back. Over time, the bending turned into breaking, then snapping, of ethics, of empathy, of any line between ambitious and predatory. By the end, whatever story they were telling themselves couldn't erase one fact. Dozens of families were left with gutted homes, demolished savings, and the psychological scars of being betrayed, not by a masked stranger, but by people they welcomed into their lives. So, what truly broke Christopher and Raquel Judge? Was it greed, the desire to live a lifestyle their business couldn't support? Pride, the refusal to admit they were in over their heads? Or something more fragile, a slow erosion of conscience under the pressure to appear successful? I want to know what you think. Tell me in the comments. Do you see them as cold-blooded con artists or as deeply flawed people who slid into crime one decision at a time? Should cases like this carry heavier sentences, knowing how hard it is for victims to ever be made whole? If this story has made you look differently at the people you trust with your home, your money, and your dreams, you're not alone. And if you want more stories that dig into the psychology behind real crimes, not just gore, but the mindset, subscribe to Broken Minds and hit the notification bell. Here, we don't just ask what happened. We ask how and why ordinary people lose control. Because in the end, the scariest part of stories like this isn't the money lost or the homes destroyed. It's a reminder that the most dangerous damage is often done without a weapon, and that the most destructive monsters are the ones we choose to trust. Broken minds create broken lives.